Chapter 11 will be covering nutrients involved in bone health. And in order to do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about bone structure. There's four parts of the bone structure that I would like for you to be familiar with. And the first is the periosteum, and this is it's connective tissue that covers all the bones, and it does have the ability to form bone. So it's kind of like an outer layer coating. And then the cortical bone is really the compact, dense bone that's on the outside of bone. The trabecular bone is the less dense, kind of more porous structure that's found in the inner layer of bones. And then bone marrow is inside of the bone. It's in the marrow cavity. And that bone marrow is a tissue in flat bones. And in those bones is where the stem cells are that form our red blood cells. Bones are constantly growing and remodeling. As we get older, less growth and more remodeling, but the way that that happens is through different types of cells that are found in our bones. One of the types of cells that breaks bone down before it's reabsorbed is an osteoclast. And reabsorption is where you're actually taking part of bone and reabsorbing it, kind of like you're reusing the minerals. And then an osteoblast is the type of cell that makes new bone. Now, sometimes people have heard of the hydroxyapatite, and what this is the really crystalline inside of bone that has the minerals, okay? So when we talk about bone mineralization, this is what we're really talking about. And inside of that is calcium, phosphorus, and some fluoride. And again, this is the bone mineral, okay? An osteocyte is a building block of bone, so it has the potential to build, and it's found inside of the bone matrix. So one of the things in looking at how healthy someone's bones are is we actually look at something called their bone mineral density. And this is really just looking at a specific place in the bone in which we look at the density of the mineral content within that bone. So when we have been studying minerals, we actually can't look at minerals and in our blood and know how much of a nutrient of our body is getting. And so things like in bones, we actually have to look at our bone mineral density as a measure. So bone is about 65% minerals, most of those being calcium, phosphorus, and some fluoride, a little bit of magnesium, and about 35% connective tissue. So this keeps the bone all together, and then it's the blood that supplies the oxygen and the energy to the bone. One of the things that's important to note about bone mass is that we pretty much build bone until about the age of 30, and then after that we actually are absorbing more bone than we're making, and so that can lead to a decline in our bone mineral density. The next slide just shows how those osteogenic cells turn into osteoblasts or osteocytes, depending on what the body needs, and how that works to help reabsorb bone. I wouldn't get too concerned about this. Okay, so what kind of factors affect how dense our bones are? Because that's really the measure of how healthy our bones are. So we want to look at biological factors within our body and then factors in our lifestyle that affect that. So a couple of things, biological factors. Women tend to have lower bone mass than men, and most of that has to do with their size. Women tend to be smaller than men, and so they're exerting less force on their bones, and that impacts their density. Age. As you age, you have less bone density, and you start to lose bone or reabsorb bone instead of building it. It's interesting that ethnicity plays a role into that. So Caucasian and Asian heritage have poorer bone health than African American descent. And really what this is talking to has a lot to do with body size. So the larger that you are, the healthier your bones are going to be. So again, frame size has to do with that too. So what about lifestyle factors? Exercise is super important for having healthy bones. Again, it's that pressure that you're putting on bones that keeps them healthy. Smoking can decrease bone density. Alcohol intake can decrease bone density. And some dietary factors, like eating a lot of phosphorus, which we're going to learn about how phosphorus is important in the bones, but one of the problems with high amounts of phosphorus is it leads our body to excrete calcium. Excess caffeine and sodium can also affect our lifestyle factors, and excess protein can also be a detriment. A diet rich in fruits, vegetables, grains, lean protein, and obviously low-fat dairy, when we start talking about that, maintain bone density. And then some other lifestyle factors are things like healthy body weight. Normal menses, women who don't menstruate, have hormonal levels that are not right, and that can interfere with bone reabsorption and bone building. We talked about the benefits of exercise. Smoking can lower bone density. Many medications like thyroid medication and steroid medications can lower bone density by stimulating excretion of certain minerals in the body. And then we talked about excessive intake of protein can do that, phosphorus, sodium, caffeine, wheat bran, that has to do with the oxalates and the phytates. And then inadequate UVB exposure. This is needed to increase the absorption or increase the vitamin D in our body, which is really the hormone that tells our body how much calcium to absorb. So how do we increase bone density with exercise? Skeletal muscle pulls against bone, and that actually signals the bone to rebuild. So exercise is very important for bone density. So let's talk a little bit about calcium. We always think of calcium when it comes to bone health. And we have a lot of calcium stored in our bone and our teeth, and calcium really is involved in the mineralization of bone. And vitamin D is a critical nutrient because it tells the body how much calcium to absorb. So 40% of all the minerals in our body are calcium, so it's the most abundant mineral found in our body. And 99% of all that calcium in our body is found in our bone and our teeth. Okay, but calcium plays a lot of other roles. It works on blood clotting, muscle contraction, lots of different metabolism. It helps with the cell membrane and cell integrity and cell differentiation. So we do know that when people have an increased calcium intake, they have a lower risk of bone fractures. And that makes sense because calcium mineralizes bone, so they're more dense. We know that adequate calcium intake can lower the intake of colon cancer, lower the intake of kidney stones, decrease lead absorption. So for young children who are prone to lead poisoning, if they live in homes that have older lead-based paints, if they are calcium deficient, they actually reabsorb a lot more of the lead, and that is detrimental, obviously, to their blood. So how do we make sure that we get enough? We need about 1,000 milligrams a day. And basically a serving of dairy, a cup, okay, or an ounce of cheese is about 300. So we typically tell people to have 3 servings a day. Now, one of the problems I have with this is that most people's servings are much larger than 8 ounces. So I'll typically tell people 2 servings of dairy plus green leafy vegetables are more than adequate amounts of calcium. So it doesn't all have to be from dairy, but dairy is by far the best absorbed source. This slide shows the calcium needed in the body by the brown, and then the intake that men and women have. So what's interesting is if you look up until about the age of, 6 or so, boys and girls tend to have the same amount of intake of calcium. Okay, but then after about 6 or 8, boys really start to go up. Girls go up a little bit, but then starting in the teenage years, around 12, we see this big differentiation where from that point on women drink less milk and men drink a little bit less, but it really doesn't fall below the RDA until well after 45, so they've built up a lot of their peak bone mass. And this is probably one of the main reasons that men have less bone fractures than women, is that men build up adequate peak bone mass before the age of 30. So what if we get too much? Well, one of the problems with calcium supplements is they cause some gastrointestinal impacts, and they also can lead to kidney stones. So the upper limit for calcium is about 2,500 milligrams, which really would be difficult to get via oral, and most of the toxicity comes from calcium on taking supplements. So how can we help calcium be absorbed? Remember, we learned about bioavailability with minerals, and one of the issues with minerals is that they compete for binding sites in the body. So one of the things that our bodies do to increase the absorption of calcium is actually when our bodies needs more. So during growth, pregnancy, lactation, we actually have more binding sites, so we will actually absorb more calcium. Levels of parathyroid hormones and vitamin D, those are two important hormones that tell the body how much calcium to absorb. Lactose, the sugar in milk, is actually really important to help absorb calcium. So it works out very nice when we get our calcium from dairy because the lactose and the vitamin D are right there. Other foods that are in the GI tract at the same time, we mentioned the oxalates and the phytates found in lots of fruits and veggies and high fiber foods can actually compete with the binding. And then you need the stomach to have an acidic environment to absorb calcium. So that is kind of interesting because a lot of people will take Tums to increase their calcium intake, but it's not really the best source. Okay, so on the other side, like I mentioned, the absorption is decreased by certain plant components, phytates and oxalates. Tannins are found in teas. If we don't have enough vitamin D, that can interfere. Diarrhea, because we're losing some of the nutrients, so we need to absorb that. And we actually start absorbing a little bit less as we get older. What are the best sources? By far, milk, yogurt, cheese. Okay, an interesting study was published a couple years ago that showed that people have better bone mineral density with increased calcium intakes and increased milk intakes. So that makes sense. But actually, when they looked at bone fractures, they found that milk was not the best predictor if somebody was going to have bone fracture. That yogurt was much more predictive. So I thought that was interesting, emphasizing the importance of yogurt. There is a lot of calcium in dark green leafy vegetables, almonds, sardines, canned salmon, and calcium fortified foods. When you get calcium from a non-dairy source, it's much harder to absorb. Here's a picture of some of the high calcium foods. Where do we typically find them? Again, mostly from the dairy group, but you do find them in the protein group as well as the fruit group if you're using calcium fortified orange juice, not just regular orange juice, but calcium fortified, and then the dark green leafy vegetables. But again, as an example, a cup of milk has about 350 milligrams of calcium, where a cup of cooked spinach is only about 100, and that's cooked. Raw spinach, it's only about 30 milligrams. So what about calcium supplements? And again, calcium supplements can actually increase the bone density, but what's interesting is it's not related necessarily to fractures. So calcium supplements are not the best way to get calcium in the diet. Okay, this talks about some different calcium supplements. Calcium carbonate, it probably has the most available calcium. What we really need to focus on is getting adequate vitamin D. So vitamin D and calcium supplementation is really what is critical in absorption of calcium. And there is enough evidence to support that if you're taking calcium, you need to also make sure that you're taking a vitamin D supplement. All right, let's move on and talk a little bit about phosphorus. Phosphorus works with vitamin D to help absorption of phosphorus as well as calcium. What does phosphorus do for our bones? We'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll talk about if most people get enough phosphorus. So I had mentioned in the first slide about the hydroxy apatite, and that is really this coating that is on the bone, and really it contributes to the bone's teeth and bone strength. I kind of liken it to at the airport I see people wrap their suitcases in this plastic. It's kind of like that. It kind of is just that one more layer. Phosphorus is important because it's actually part of all of our DNA and RNA. It's part of ATP. It helps in the Krebs or the TCA cycle in allowing ATP to generate from B vitamins, and it's a component of the phospholipid membrane, and it helps maintain blood pH and fluid balance. How do we make sure that we get enough? Americans get plenty of phosphorus because it's in high protein foods. So we'll look at that. So it's in milk, cheese, meat, bread. So really we get more than adequate amounts. So people in the United States are not deficient. So protein foods, high in phosphorus. So one of the problems about getting too much phosphorus, and most of the time this comes from either supplementation or drinking too much soda, is there an imbalance in the phosphorus and calcium ratio, so the bones don't become dense. The mineralization